So slowing the music down a little bit, because I think one of the things we need to do is relax. I mean, we've been through a lot this weekend. We've been through a lot in the last 22 months, really. So we've got some terrific guests for you today, but I kind of want you to think about this as a front porch, where we're all going to sit here and just think about where we are right now and maybe where we're headed.
Don't always seem to hit you right when you think you can lay back easy. Those times are hard to come by, sitting still with nothing on your mind.
So I want you to stress a little less. We're going to talk about some stressful stuff. We've got terrific guests. We're lucky to have built up some relationships with some very, very well-informed people in this era of the Mueller investigations and all the other things that swirl around it. So later on the show today, you'll hear Dahlia Lithwick. I mean, who else? She's been with us forever. We believe Ross Garber, who proves that they're unquestionably the most credentialed impeachment lawyer in the United States, will be joining us. Right now, though, we're very excited to have with us someone we've spoken to before, Asha Rangappa, Director of Admissions and Senior Lecturer at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, former FBI agent, karaoke singer. That may not be relevant. So, first of all, welcome back to our show.
Thank you.
The place I would like to start with you, because I think it's really in your wheelhouse, is, we're all talking about sort of what might be the underlying findings of the Mueller report and what Attorney General Barr is saying about that. But this whole thing, the Mueller, one thing we know about the Mueller report, and kind of even the Barr letter, is it starts with a reminder of the massive counterintelligence case that has existed and I assume continues to exist here in the United States, that we know that just massive amounts of work was done by the Russian government and that incredible approaches were made to all kinds of people connected to Donald Trump, from Jeff Sessions to Michael Flynn to Jared Kushner to Paul Manafort to Donald Trump Jr. to George Papadopoulos to Carter Page to Mike Flynn. I'm sure I'm leaving people out, but the Russian operatives tried to get at this campaign any way they could, and they also managed separately from that to cyber infiltrate our electoral process, hack our electoral process. I mean, there's still, Asha, I assume, a huge counterintelligence case sitting out there.
Absolutely. I mean, I have been saying for the last 2 years that, people's over-reliance on the criminal charges that are filed in the Mueller investigation is really missing the biggest part of this investigation. Very rarely do counterintelligence investigations see the inside of a courtroom.
Right.
And this is for a number of reasons. First is that you're protecting sensitive sources and methods. You don't want to lay all your cards out on the table. But also because there may be these things may be hard to prove. The bar for criminal charges beyond a reasonable doubt is incredibly high, and especially when you're dealing with a very sophisticated foreign intelligence service like Russia's. They aren't leaving a trail. The whole point of a covert operation is to create plausible deniability, and so being able to put together the kind of case that you would normally do in, say, a conspiracy investigation will be really hard. But that doesn't mean that there was not significant intelligence of all of the things that you just mentioned, the contacts, what was going on, what was Russia trying to do, did they receive any receptiveness, how were they able to execute all of their different fronts in the Russian interference operation. All of that is going to be contained in the counterintelligence findings.
Right. And one point that you guys have made at justsecurity.org, too, is and once again, this isn't the same thing as provable collusion. But in all of those contexts, those myriad, dozens and dozens of contacts between Russian operatives, Russian intermediaries, and people who are tied in a key way to either the campaign or the administration, as far as we can tell, nobody ever went, wow, nobody ever hung up the phone or clicked off an email and said, I better tell somebody about this. I just got contacted by a Russian agent who's really interested in X, Y, and Z. I better go tell the FBI about this. I mean, nobody apparently ever thought about doing that.
No one thought about doing it. I mean, you have the Trump Tower meeting where you have a Russian lawyer who's basically affiliated with the Russian government offering dirt on Hillary Clinton. This whole investigation started because of George Papadopoulos being offered dirt on Hillary Clinton. Not to mention that, by the way, in early August of 2016, the FBI briefed the campaigns and said, Russia will be making approaches to you. They are trying to interfere in our election. Let us know if you see anything suspicious. And yet, even after that very explicit warning, we don't have anyone reporting their contacts with Russia and, in fact, lie about it almost to a person. And in fact, I don't know of a single person in this campaign who has actually been truthful about their contacts. And then, of course, Trump himself, who was concealing his business interest in Russia during the campaign. We really just don't know the story about that, all of those things. And why were they not forthcoming about these contacts? What was it that they were trying to conceal? And even if it wasn't illegal, what is it that they believed would harm their perhaps their election chances, or would be embarrassing or unethical, that they were not wanting to see the light of day?
There's another why that we don't know. I'm sure there are lots of whys. But another why that we don't know is why Russia wanted to do all this. In other words, at a certain point, they went from a kind of generalized interest in disrupting the comity and the peaceful procedures, to the extent that we have any, of our electoral politics, to very specifically trying to pick a winner and a loser. And I don't know if that's going to be anywhere there in underlying documents that never might see the light of day if it's there in counterintelligence reports. But as far as I know, we don't know why they would want one candidate over another.
Well, I mean, I think if you are more familiar with Putin and his history with Hillary Clinton in particular, I think that the reasons become more clear. Mm-hmm. So I think the specific reason is that Hillary Clinton made public statements as Secretary of State following Putin's election in 2011 or 2012. And those were followed by protests in Russia. And Putin believes, I think to his core, that it was really the U.S. government that was behind, these protests against his election, and that the Russian people were puppets of the American government in trying to delegitimize him, and he blames Hillary Clinton for that. So there is a personal vendetta against her. But remember that either way, Putin wins, because when he can cast doubt on the legitimacy of our election overall, when people on one side or the other don't believe that the outcome is fair or objective, then he also discredits the democratic project and democratic small d to his own people, and basically says, look, democracy is a farce, and what you've got here is the best that you can do.
Asha Rangappa, I know you've got a busy day. We don't have too much more time with you. So let me just ask the most open-ended question I can. What is it you now want to know that you think you might be able to know as some of the underlying documents or the full Mueller report itself, as that begins to trickle out? What do you want to know?
Well, remember that there's two big pieces to this investigation. There's the obstruction piece and there's the collusion piece. I think on the obstruction piece, I want to just see what was the evidence that Mueller collected. Mm-hmm. He decided to not come to a conclusion on whether or not it was chargeable as an offense because it created many questions of law and fact because we are talking about the president. And it sounds like, and he said that Trump was not completely exonerated. So there's something there, and I think we need to see what he's collected, because that is of interest to Congress and the American people from a, political perspective. On the collusion side, I would like to see a narrative of what was happening, what happened with these meetings and these contacts. Did anything ever come of them? I think, like I said, even if these people were at most just receptive and behaving unethically and didn't cross any criminal lines, I think we still need to know that story. If for nothing else than to understand what Russia was trying to do, because I think it's pretty clear that they are going to try it again.
Right. John Dickerson coined the phrase that the members of the Trump camp were collusion curious. And I think that says it pretty well. All right, Asha Rangappa, I know you're busy. We're going to let you go. Director of Admissions, Senior Lecturer at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, former FBI agent, also with justsecurity.org. Thanks for doing this.
No problem. Thank you so much.
All right. Now we're going to take a little break. Let me just tell you this, too. We're going to take a little break. We're going to bring in, we're so lucky. I'm so lucky that, I don't know how long ago this was. I saw this writer, Dahlia Lithwick. I think it was with another radio station. And I thought, wow, she's great. So now because of that debt, she has to continue to appear on the show basically forever. It's like in a fairy tale or something. So that's who we're going to talk to. I do want to say that I want to make some room for you. I know that you all have been sitting there kind of gnawing on this information or possibly one of your limbs over the weekend, and that you may have things that you want to say. So we'll find some room somewhere in the lineup today. We've got all these terrific guests, but we'll find some room for you to call in at 860-275-7266. But not just now, because we're going to take the break. We're coming back to Dahlia.
It's an emotional roller coaster, and it costs too much. Emotional roller coaster.
Yeah, but more of a front porch than a scramble. We know a lot of people. They've all been following this story. We're kind of having them all step up on the front porch, talk a little bit about how it looks right now. One thing we know is nothing is going to change in particular in the next 24 hours. Nothing changed that much in the last 24 hours. Dahlia Lithwick is with us now. We're so lucky to get her. Slate's courts and law reporter, host of the podcast. Oh, no, I'm going to do my mental block thing. Is it amicus or amicus? Amicus or I'm going to say it's amicus. Did I do it right?
You are right.
Yeah. I just, it's one of those things where I used to know this guy who knew that his wife, Marianne, either did or didn't have an E at the end of her name. And I always felt that marriage was in trouble, and I was right. So if you know it's one or the other, that's not really like knowing something. All right. So, we've talked about this a bunch of times before. Maybe a place that I'd like to start is, Dahlia, Robert Mueller, despite all the caterwauling today about illegal takedowns, Robert Mueller's kind of turned out to be who we always said he was, who we always thought he was, right? A guy who was going to be very, very careful and maybe collegial almost to a fault and not overstep and not overreach, quite the opposite from what we can see.
Right. I think I had been warning, and you're right, I think you and I have talked about this, Colin, that, if you expected a superhero, somebody to come in, flashing a flaming sword, like this was never going to be the guy. This is a lifelong Republican. This is a guy who has worked within the very narrow guardrails of the most small c conservative institution, not politically, capital C, but just one of those institutions that is all about being norm-bound and rule-bound and as small as you can be. And the idea that, people had the votive candles and the mugs and the I Heart Mueller headbands, that was us, right? That was us looking for some easy way out. And I think there's a weird way in which so much of the narrative, even in the last couple of weeks as this was heating up, was he's going to indict Trump. He was never going to indict Trump. There's Office of Legal Counsel guidance that says you can't indict a sitting president. And I think we just got so far out ahead of our skis in terms of expectations that when he performed exactly to the task that he was meant to perform, we all feel like it's a crushing defeat. So I think it's, in some sense, Democrats who were looking for some kind of vindication, some kind of magic, with a bow on top answer, are frustrated. But I don't think Mueller was ever going to be that guy.
A counter argument that gets made is, well, what's a special counsel for? A special counsel is theoretically somebody who can lift something out of the realm of political appointees and hive it off and give it some shelter and look at it in this much more independent way. And that the net result of what Mueller did, at least especially as far as the obstruction of justice stuff goes, is that he handed it back to a political appointee, and not even just any political appointee, a guy who was sort of handpicked on short notice with a 19-page memo, declared interested in handling this a certain way, that in a way, being so sort of courtly and giving everything back to Barr, he kind of took some of the purpose away from what a special counsel can do.
Well, yes and no. I think, one thing to remember is that we don't know that he gave it to Barr. What we know is that he said, I can't exonerate, I can't convict. Barr took it upon himself, apparently with Rod Rosenstein, to make a finding there, to make a conclusion of law. And so, I think one wants to be a little bit careful about saying that, he wanted this massive hundreds and hundreds of pages of report that he did to be, in the span of under 48 hours, to have a legal declaration made by Barr saying, okay, I think he can't have obstructed. So I think it's a little bit trickier than that. I mean, I completely take your larger point, which is one way or another what he did was hand this back to the political branches, whether it's, handing it back to Barr, who, works for Trump, Barr, who, by the way, auditions to be Attorney General by writing a memo saying there's no such thing as obstruction. The president can't ever commit obstruction. So, we knew where Barr was going to come down on that. But in a deeper way, I think what he's done is said, and this kind of goes back to Leon Jaworski and the roadmap, to Watergate, but I think what he has said at some level is this isn't a criminal matter that is going to be handled by criminal indictments. There is a huge mass of information. We don't know any of it. We have a brief summary from Barr. There's a huge mass of information, and Congress should get to work figuring it out, and whether or not this rises to the level of a criminal conspiracy or kind of quid pro quo agreement with Russia to steal the election in exchange for, lifting sanctions, whatever it is, it may not have been a crime, but that isn't necessarily the bar we've set as a constitutional democracy. So get to work, Congress. And I think that too is in keeping with Robert Mueller's temperament and personality.
I want to come back to get to work, Congress, but I think it's also worth noting this was a 22-month investigation that produced, as you say, a pretty, we haven't seen it yet, but it's going to be a pretty massive amount of stuff. Now, either Barr and Rosenstein, they just got a big urn of Starbucks and some white crosses or whatever they used in college and ordered a lot of Chinese food and said, boy, we just got to do this. We just got to burn it all night long for 48 hours and figure this thing out. Or they kind of knew what they were going to do anyway. I mean, it seems like a very snap decision. I mean, it's physically impossible that they reviewed the Mueller report in its entirety and came out there. So, I mean, it does sort of send a signal that, well, this is kind of the way it was going to be.
I think that's right. And I think, again, if you look back at, Barr's memo that he wrote in the summer, sort of auditioning for this position, where he talked about how inappropriate it was even to look at obstruction. If you look at, the conclusions he therefore makes, where he says, and I think that this is factually incorrect, by the way, David Lurie has a great piece up at Slate saying, factually and legally, it is wrong to say that if you did not do the predicate crime, you can't therefore be tagged for obstruction, which is the legal analysis that we get from Barr and Rosenstein. That's wrong, right? I mean, Lurie says Martha Stewart did obstruction.
I was just going to say Martha Stewart.
Right. So that's just incorrect. So I think, one of the ways to think about this is, and there's several places, right? He says collusion with the Russian government. That wasn't the only question, right? The Russian government is part of it, but, what about WikiLeaks? What about, people who are not formally working for the Russian government who had contacts with the Trump administration? So in a way, the entire 4-page summary defines crimes as things Donald Trump didn't do. And not these are the crimes the way that we think of them. And so I think you're completely right to say this looks, as I read it, and if you look at it alongside all of the indictments that already exist, what Mueller was doing in plain sight, both about the hacks and the release of the wiki release and also the attempts to influence the election, if you look at all of that has unrolled in the last 2 years, it cannot be the case that the definition of those improper behaviors that Barr and Rosenstein use in their memo is correct. And so I think what they did is reverse engineered the memo to say Trump didn't do this with the, quote, Russian government, therefore nothing to see here. And I think we know from all of the mass of Mueller's other work that there is a lot to see here. So it does feel as though the memo was written to exculpate. And as I said, I think that it's really important to remember that this doesn't end what the Southern District of New York is looking into, what courts in Virginia and D.C. are looking into, what state attorneys general are looking into, right? If the baseline were, did Donald Trump commit these crimes as defined by Barr, I think everybody could be as depressed as they want to be today. But I think that that is not the baseline. The baseline is, self-dealing, corruption, grift and quid pro quos, and those will be examined in other courts around the country. I promise those are not going away.
Right. It is sort of, you notice the even though they're often compared and linked, the differences between Mueller and Comey, right? Because Comey, when his turn came, particularly with the Hillary Clinton stuff, he said, well, we're not going to prosecute, we're not going to proceed. But boy, this really sucked, and it was really undisciplined. This is disgusting, but we're not going to do anything about it. But it was really disgusting. I want to emphasize how disgusting and undisciplined and wrong it was. And Mueller, who I think very easily and more justifiably, given all of the stuff that we do know about Russian contact between their intermediaries and Trump's intermediaries, he could make a speech like that. That's just not appropriate or anywhere in his wheelhouse.
Yeah, I think that in some sense the tragedy of this is that Mueller isn't Ken Starr, right? Yeah. Ken Starr, who devoted, years to what really was this deeply salacious, in the weeds, unrelated to, the thing that he was tasked with investigating. And in some sense, because of Ken Starr, the special counsel rules get rewritten to be far more constrained and circumscribed. And then you get a human being like Bob Mueller, who is himself far more constrained and circumscribed. And, he's not Jim Comey. He's not Ken Starr. He is essentially a prosecutor who was looking at a very narrow lane. Was there, this counterintelligence operation? Were people in Trump's orbit compromised by foreign powers? And what spun off slightly from that, which is, were there crimes involved in that, and was there obstruction? That's what he was tasked with. And so I think while we may have all hoped that looking at Deutsche Bank and Jared's loans and what was going on with Eric Prince and the Seychelles, all of that, we want that story, right? This like Dickens-sized volume of misconduct. But again, he's been chronicling the misconduct in these speaking indictments for years. We know how many people who worked on Trump's campaign have either, pleaded guilty or are in jail for their misconduct. All of this is known. It's out in the open. And so the idea that we needed it repackaged is very much a reality show idea. It's not a legal idea at all.
So last question. Now a lot of this does shift over. We often talk about how some of these questions are probably more appropriately addressed in Congress, that in some ways the kind of criminal justice mechanism that exists here in the United States doesn't do well with, say, sitting presidents. But you look over now at Congress and, they're not exactly perfectly equipped either because they're political animals. It's a political process. You've got members of Congress today kind of hilariously saying, well, this is still important and we're still going to look into it, but there's certainly a lot of other important domestic and foreign issues that are going to affect the 2020 elections. And we're going to make sure we talk about those too. And it's unclear to them how much of their central purpose should be the continuation of this, because it isn't exactly what they were born to do either.
I can't remember who tweeted it, Colin, but somebody tweeted this morning that an awful lot of members, at least in the House and the Judiciary Committee, are actually kind of grateful that they don't have to go on TV and talk about this and only this, because they would really actually like to talk about other things, including the economy, including healthcare. So I think in one way they may be almost well served by the fact that the myopic, monomaniacal cable news Mueller thing has gone away. That said, I think that they will continue to, whether it's subpoenaing Mueller, whether it's trying to get their hands on some leaked version of this, I think they're going to continue to use this to tell this larger story of corruption and self-dealing and incompetence without necessarily being bound by the idea that this is going to get resolved when the president is cuffed on the White House lawn and goes to jail. That was never a good narrative because it was never going to happen. And I think maybe a slightly more realistic tale of, do you want a president who's profiting at his hotels, from foreign governments? That's a story I think they can tell, that those lawsuits continue, that those stories will, I think, have some salience. So in a strange way, the fact that there are political animals untethered now from a legal narrative that I think in the end of the day was bound to disappoint, it may redound to their benefit.
It's a good place to end. We're so lucky to get you, Dahlia Lithwick, Slate's courts and law reporter, host of the podcast Amicus, which you should definitely be listening to. Thank you so much for doing this once again.
Thank you, Colin.
All right, so when we get back, we'll be talking to the Better Call Saul of impeachment, the guy you got to call if you're getting impeached. That's Ross. Nobody's getting impeached right now. I just want to say that at the moment, or at least that I'm aware of. Nobody. He would be aware if somebody was getting impeached. Nobody's getting impeached right now, but if anybody does, they're going to need to talk to Ross.
Everything leads to corruption. Everything leads to corruption.
Today's show was produced as a result of a conspiracy between Scott Breedy, an agent of Spectre, and me, Kion Wolfnovsky, an agent of Thrush. Amanda Fish did not obstruct justice. Our intern is Kayla Thomas. The part of Bill Curry was played by Mike Flynn. On tomorrow's show, we go back to the days when all the famous cartoonists and comic strip makers lived in Connecticut. And now, back to Colin.
All right. So, and I do promise, towards the end of the show today, I'm going to make some room for your phone calls. I know you've got things on your mind, things in your heart, things you may want to get off your chest. So those are 3 different locations right there. So you've seen the billboard signs by the highway. Impeaching the boss? Better call Ross. Ross Garber, attorney and CNN legal analyst who teaches political investigations and impeachments at Tulane Law School and has represented Republican governors in Connecticut, Alabama, South Carolina, and Missouri who were facing impeachment. I've known him since his first impeachment. I've watched him grow. So Ross Garber, welcome back to the show.
Hey, it's good to be here, Colin. Thanks.
So let's give credit where credit is due. 13 months ago, in the op-ed of the L.A. Times, you write, will the president be charged with a crime? Will Mueller send a report to Congress so that it can initiate impeachment hearings? I think he will do neither. That's what you wrote 13 months ago. You called it.
I did. Yeah, it's like the blind squirrel, right?
Not at all.
Every once in a while, yeah, I called this one.
So now, when you made that call, and as you watched it unfold over the last 13 months, is that because the apparatus doesn't really exist very easily to do those kinds of things? In other words, we know from the guidelines, essentially, that it's not really baked into the special counsel apparatus as we have it now.
Yeah, it's not at all. And I think where I was coming from was having done a bunch of impeachments and represented a bunch of political officials in other kinds of cases, and teaching this stuff and litigating this stuff, I think I probably have a little more perspective on it. And that's exactly right. So there was an Independent Counsel Act back during Clinton, which said that if an independent counsel found any evidence of impeachable conduct, he had to turn that over to the House. That act expired. That doesn't exist anymore. And so now we've got these regulations at the Department of Justice, and those regulations are different. They don't say that at all. They say the Attorney General, who, normally is a presidential appointee, the Attorney General gets to decide. It's totally up to him what information goes to Congress, what information goes to the public, and what doesn't. And there are regulations of the Department of Justice saying that a president can't be indicted. And so that's sort of, what led us here today.
So one thing that I know, being the beneficiary occasionally of your wisdom, is that impeachments and things that are like impeachments happen at different levels. They might happen at an investigatory level the way we've been talking about. They may happen in congressional hearings, but they also happen in the public arena. And one of the things that probably a public official has to do with able assistance is think about how to talk about that, how it's going to be talked about in the public arena. And I have to say that I don't talk about the blind squirrel. I don't know whether this is the case or not, but in a way, I think Donald Trump or somebody has been kind of a genius in the sense that he kept saying, no collusion, no collusion, no collusion. So he made that the deal breaker or the deal maker. And in then getting the finding that he got, I mean, I think in the court of public opinion, that's a pretty big win for him.
Yeah, he was incredible at defining the issue and staying on message over and over and over and over and over again. No collusion, no collusion, no collusion. I once worked for a public official who said, "He who defines the issue wins the debate," and that is often true. And Trump had an instinct and has an instinct from it for that. I mean, he defined the issue as no collusion. And, lots of egghead lawyers and commentators and other folks would say, well, it's not really about collusion. It's about conspiracy, and that's more nuanced. Or they'd say there are other issues, and he'd say no collusion, no collusion, no collusion, no collusion. And he has the bully pulpit. And so, yes, he was able to define the issue so that yesterday, when the Attorney General came out and said no collusion, the press and others generally reported that essentially Trump won.
Yes, and certainly he's been taking a victory lap all day long. Although, in a way, he has a tendency to overplay his hand. And so today he's running around saying illegal takedown. I mean, it seems to me, as I was saying to Dahlia earlier, that the characteristics of the Mueller probe and his forwarding to Barr has been kind of the opposite. I mean, just really, even Barr said in his initial 4-page letter, did I ever have to rein him in? Did he overreach? Did he overstep? No. For this to be an illegal takedown seems like a mischaracterization of the sort of general collegiality and probity of Robert Mueller.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see the president back off of the illegal takedown stuff and maybe be a little more gracious toward the special counsel. But right now, we were talking about defining the issue. Right now, what the president is going to be challenged to do is figure out what the defining issue is going to be now, because a lot of folks out there are going to be saying, yes, but, all right, no collusion, but maybe obstruction, but maybe this, but maybe that, but maybe, issues in the Southern District of New York. The president is going to, you'll see, I think, test out some themes for what he wants to define the issue to be.
And the other people who will be testing out themes will be members of Congress. You seem to feel as though an awful lot of the decision-making power about how powerfully this will be explored may reside in Speaker Pelosi herself.
Yes. Yeah, I think the committee chairs and certainly the rank and file members are going to be taking their lead and direction from her, although she's certainly aware of what the rank and file and what the committee chairs want, but she is a very, very, very talented politician. She knows how to read a poll. She knows how to read voters. And, and I've been saying, I don't think she wants an impeachment fight about this. I don't think she wants impeachment proceedings. She doesn't want to be the next Newt Gingrich or Bob Livingston, who, ultimately lost their positions during the Clinton impeachment fight. I don't think she wants any of that. And so it'll be interesting over the next few days and weeks to see how hard she and her committee chairs push for hearings, push for documents, push for information. I think at this point, I'm expecting them not to be incredibly aggressive about this. I think they'd rather run straight up on the issues in 2020 and run against the president.
Well, I mean, Ross, another thing that you've pointed out, though, is it isn't that they have to start an investigation. They've already been investigating. And it's conceivable that some of these committees have already collected testimony or evidence that speaks more forcefully than Barr is prepared to do towards some of these issues. In other words, if one of these committees is already developing evidence that really does make a powerful case for obstruction of justice, what happens then? What happens if their stuff doesn't really line up that well with the way Barr is processing Mueller's work?
Yeah, I think we might already know it if that were the case. But, the person I'm watching most is former Connecticut resident Mark Warner, who is now the Senate Intelligence Committee vice chair. So he's the ranking Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee. That committee has been doing an incredibly detailed, thorough, bipartisan investigation. They've talked to tons of witnesses, collected lots and lots of documents. And I think that's the place to look. The House Intelligence Committee investigation was partisan and probably not as effective as what the Senate has done. I say let's look at the Senate and let's see what the Senate says they found, and in particular, let's see what Democratic Senator Mark Warner says about the information about conspiracy or collusion or working with Russians or anything that the Senate Intelligence Committee has found. Typical
East of the River guy, sticking with the guy from Rockville. I hear that. Or Vernon, or wherever he's from. I guess the other thing we should acknowledge, and it's been widely acknowledged, is the notion that we'll ever see the full Mueller report seems quixotic. I mean, there are things that have to be redacted, things that fall within grand jury stuff, things that maybe are counterintelligence. I mean, how high should anybody's expectations be set here?
So that is a debate. I've in the past year or so, I've started using Twitter more. That's a debate that I seem to be having a lot on Twitter these days. And in particular, I don't know if you've had Asha Rangappa on.
Yeah, she was on at the top of the show. Yeah.
So I missed her. So she and I have gone back and forth. And one piece of advice is to never get into a Twitter war with Asha.
No.
But anyway, so that's a big issue. I think most people expect us to see a lot of the Mueller report and the underlying information. I'm not so sanguine. I don't think we're going to see that much that we don't already know, because what's going to happen is the Attorney General is going to take out information that's protected by grand jury secrecy. He's going to take out information that is protected by classified. He'll take out information, probably a lot of it, that's derogatory or negative information about people who haven't been charged with crimes. And then he'll potentially take out a bunch of stuff that's covered by executive privilege, presidential communications, and deliberative process. I think once you take all that out, once you sift all that out, there's not going to be much left.
Well, possibly on that note, we'll conclude, Ross, other than to say, I mean, if you had to sort of predict, say, from now to the election, and that's a risky thing to do, predicting how the narrative goes. It seems, based on what you're saying and really what everybody else is saying, that this is not going to be decided in any legally decisive sense in between now and the election, that Trump may limp into the electoral season dinged up by some of this stuff, but also triumphant in the eyes of others.
I'm not sure I'd go that far. Two things to I think, look for on the legal front, which actually could make a big impact. One is the Southern District of New York is continuing an investigation related to Trump and his businesses. And imagine being a prosecutor in that office and seeing Trump do a victory lap. Watch what happens out of the Southern District. Subpoenas, witnesses, indictments, watch that. And the second thing to watch is how aggressive Congress gets. Do they issue subpoenas? Do they hold public hearings? Do they try to enforce subpoenas? How hard do they go? And in particular, do they get any cooperators on any issues, including obstruction? So watch those two things.
Let me ask you a quick question about the first thing, and I don't know how easy it would be to answer, but it's based on some very deep legal research that I've been doing by watching the series Billions on Showtime. So in that, at a certain point, there's a new attorney general on Billions, answerable to a different kind of precedent with a different set of attitudes, who, in communicating with the Southern District of New York, is able to order different sets of priorities. And I just wonder, I don't know if we know how much of a stranglehold or any kind of hold Attorney General Barr would exert over the Southern District of New York, but he does have some power over it, right?
Yeah, well, organizationally, he definitely does. But the prosecutors in that office often refer to it, the SDNY as the sovereign District of New York because of the amount of independence it has. And it generally does exercise a ton of independence, which is why I think that's the office to watch.
All right. Well, Ross Garber, nobody's getting impeached, so you're like the Maytag guy. You're just sitting there waiting. Yeah, you're just sitting there waiting. Thank you so much for joining us, though.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
That's Ross Garber, who I've known since his first impeachment. He is an attorney and CNN legal analyst who teaches political investigations and impeachments at Tulane Law School and has represented Republican governors. I mean, this has got to be a record, right? Republican governors in Connecticut, Alabama, South Carolina, and Missouri, all of them facing impeachment. Of course, the Connecticut one was John Rowland, where just so we know. So Ross, in my recollection, was at that time more in the Ty Cobb kind of role. He was really representing the office of the governor, as opposed to representing Governor Rowland himself, just so you know. It's always a little bit different that way. All right, so I have left some time for you here at the end. The number is 860-275-7266, 860-275-7266. And, I really did feel as though it would be better. What happens on Friday when we get the word? We had already been talking about, what'll happen if the Mueller report drops and what are we going to do? And then you get the word. And then Friday night, you watch all of these pundits who have nothing to look at whatsoever. They have no report. They don't know, what to say. And there's a kind of feverishness, and that it kind of rolls through the weekend. And I just sort of felt as though, and it's one of the reasons I'm making the phone lines available, if you want to use them, 860-275-7266, 860-275-7266. It's more like, how do you want to live the next few months of your life? How do you want to live maybe the next 2 years of your life? And with that in mind, I want to actually play a little clip here. I've got to get better at saying his name because he's like my favorite political candidate. He's my favorite presidential candidate right now. But I haven't quite mastered how you say the name of the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. But he's Democratic presidential hope. I like to call him Mayor Pete. That's what he likes to call himself. Buttigieg. Is that pretty good, Scott? Buttigieg. Yeah. All right. So anyway, let's hear a little bit of him on this.
I would argue a figure like this president should never have been able to come within cheating distance of the Oval Office. And I fear that if we're not paying attention to the causes that he's a symptom of, then not only is it possible for him to succeed in 2020, but we could also find ourselves with another figure like him, or even worse, in the future.
I love this guy. But, he's kind of nailing it here, too. Just to go back to the very beginning of our show today. And once again, we do have open phone lines available for you to opine on, 860-275-7266. That's 860-275-7266. When you look at, one thing that was really helpful to me on Friday, I went over to lawfare.com. Lawfare, if you want to really geek out on something like this, lawfare.com is a great place not only to read, but occasionally to listen to podcasts where they don't worry too much about production values. They just like try to tell you what's going on. Well, it turned out about a week and a half ago, in getting ready for the Mueller report, they had done this thing that was a little bit more produced than what they usually do, but they had taken Mueller's so-called speaking indictments. So these, when Mueller issued indictments, they would often have quite a bit of narrative in them. That's called a speaking indictment. And so whether he's indicting Russian agents or Michael Flynn or whoever, or Paul Manafort, there'd be quite a bit of information. And so what they did was they kind of turned those into almost little soliloquies. And they had a series of people just kind of read the words with very little editing of the Mueller team. And you just became aware of how much was already known, how much has already been made part of the record. Yes, the initial Russian interest in disrupting the peacefulness of our elections and destabilizing our democracy, the subsequent interest of Russian agents in specifically aiding Trump over Clinton, the hacking of the servers of the Democratic Congressional Committee, the Democratic National Committee. The activities of Paul Manafort, the activities of Michael Flynn, just listening to all those things be read through, you just think, wow, there were just all these guys with these tremendously intricate Russian connections and a Russian apparatus that was unquestionably, at a level that's probative right now, I think, interested in doing harm to our process. How did we ever get there? And how did we ever reach a point where, knowing everything that we know, it's possible for at least some of us, maybe not you and me, but for some of us to say, okay, so it was really nothing. Really, when you really get down to it, it was nothing. I mean, when you listen to, when you listen to, I think what Mayor Pete called, they got within cheating distance, and how did that happen? And I think that really is the big question. I think he's coined it perfectly. I hope that as a country, we still need to know more about this stuff. We still need to know as much as possible what kinds of things Mueller is talking about when he says that there was evidence on both sides in terms of obstruction of justice. Some evidence strongly suggesting obstruction, some evidence perhaps leading in the other direction. We really do want to know that's pretty significant for the special counsel to say that. We at minimum need to know what's meant by that. I'm sure, I think I've said on the air before that I never really thought that the Russian collusion thing was going to be the thing that, so many of the other aspects that are being looked into seem to involve things like tax evasion and money laundering. I think in this case, we are going to go back to Deep Throat and Hal Holbrook and follow the money. There's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to come out about the Trump organization's relationship to money and ways in which that filters out into the kinds of stories that we've been talking about. But I think Mayor Pete is also right. The real question is, how did our country get to this place? How did we arrive at a place where any of this was even borderline acceptable? How did we come to a moment where people like this could be in the White House, self-dealing all day long, pursuing their own economic interests, meeting with countries that they're going to meet off-site with later about loans that people like Jared need for their defaulting properties. How did we reach this point? Because I'm old enough to have lived through the Nixon White House, and that was upsetting. Once you realized the enormity and the pervasiveness of what Watergate was, I remember my father, a lifelong Republican, being just totally freaked out with the how monumental it was. But, that was a case where it kind of gradually got like that. Here, I feel like it's been like that since day one, and somehow or other, we live with it. And Mayor Pete has the right question. How do we get here, and how do we get to another place where this isn't just, something that the water got turned up a degree a day until we were boiling lobsters in it?